Cheshire asks, is the slave just viewed as property? Perhaps, so it's an amount equal to the property, like a fence or something.
Yeah, so I'll go wide to the ancient Near East because and then we'll come into the Hebrew Bible. So I think people have this idea that if your property, what I hear is you're a beat up old couch, right? And actually, Steve, I think when you made the comparison to like a pet, that's actually not too bad. So slaves,
high praise, I'll take that.
No, I mean, but take it out of the Hebrew Bible setting. In the ancient Near East, you couldn't just do whatever you wanted to your slave, right? For example, Raymond Westbrook talks about, and I think it's the Laws of Eshnunna, it says that if your slave does X, if you take him before the judges and he's found guilty of that, then you can, do something to his ear, which is probably to mark him as a chattel slave.
Yeah. Is that the driving the nail, the awl through the ear thing?
Right. That's what you see in Exodus 21.
Yeah.
But the point is, while it seems, and you see this in like the Middle Assyrian laws, you see things like this in the Middle Assyrian palace decrees, there are things that you do to a slave that sound really bad to us. But the point is that they have rights. So chattel slaves have maybe fewer rights. Debt slaves in general are to be treated a little more gently, primarily because the master owns the labor, owns the right to the labor. Now, this is in the law, and I want to be clear about this. This is in the law, not in practice. So you see in the Bible, in Jeremiah 34, Nehemiah chapter 5, debt slaves can't leave, period. Deuteronomy 23, 15 to 16 does not apply to Hebrew slaves. We can talk about that if you want, but practically speaking, they can't go. This is the whole point of Jeremiah 34. They released the slaves during the siege, and then as soon as and it was way longer than the 6 years. And the prophets were like, "What are you doing? You got to let them go." So they let them go, and then they went out and took them all back in. Right. So slaves, it's practically speaking, there's just not this freedom to go. So I see similarities, Dr. Rana, in the military. I get what you're saying. It's sort of like a Venn diagram. There are some similarities, but there are also some big distinctions.
Yeah. As somebody in the military, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, you do give us some rights. I mean, there's no question about it. You have agreed to say, look, I'm going to be treated as the United States property per se. And they don't mean the kind of property you can do whatever they want to, but you do give up some of your liberties more than anything, rights. But they give up your liberties when you join the military, and you have to conform to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But that is not, to me, what I consider to be any kind of actual slavery. That'd be more along the lines of economic slavery or wage labor of some kind, because you have a contractual agreement.
That's my point. That's what I think is being described in the
I get that's what you're trying to say. It is, and that would be an analogy in that way. Let me ask you this real quick. Let me ask you two questions. One was in the live chat, and I want to get out because I know we're running out of time. But I thought it was a really good question. I don't remember who it was, so forgive me. But was there any civilizations around the time that just abolished slavery, that just said, right off the bat, it's bad?
Not that I know of.
Okay. And the other thing I got to notice this. In Leviticus 25, the very last thing, because you said, read to the end, and 54 and 55, it talks about, for the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Is he giving special dispensation to the Israelites because nobody else should be their, servant to them? He owns them.
That's correct. That's the whole point. Yeah,
that's the way I'm reading
slaves. Yeah, they're his slaves.
Yeah,
and that's the word that's used. And the word eved, just to clarify this, the word eved, it's like the word run in English, right? Run can have like 10 different meanings depending on the context. That does it. So eved, like a king, if you read through the Amarna letters, for example, they'll say one king will say to the Pharaoh, your servant, your slave writes to you. So, people have made the argument then, well, wait a minute, the king's a slave. So that means, slave doesn't mean anything. Well, you can't go that far. It's all about the context. It's all about what is in the context. And in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, these are in contrast to the Israelites. These are full slaves. These are chattel slaves. They are kept for life. They're landed property. Their property, their achuzah. They're passed down as inheritance. Their children are passed down as inheritance. kept for life, la'olam, there in the Hebrew, forever. And then there's a strong contrast in verse 46. It says, but you cannot treat my servants, the Israelites, ruthlessly with perech, which is the word that's used to describe what happened to them, like in Exodus 1:13 in Egypt. I'll stop talking.
We have a question from Terry Rathman that, Fuzz, in your studies, let me know what you found on this, and maybe Josh, you can comment. Terry Rathman says, so how did other cultures treat their slaves as compared to what God prescribed for treating slaves? And then he says, kind of tongue in cheek, any takers on which system you would want to be a slave?
Well, I mean, I think, from my perspective, I don't know, I'm not familiar with the cultures of the ancient Near East, so I can't really answer that, other than to say, as I've spent quite a bit of time recently looking through these passages, what impresses me time and time again is how much effort is being placed on, and how much emphasis, is being placed on how to protect those people that are vulnerable within this, is the society of Israel, right? How do we protect these people from being oppressed? I'm really impressed with again, the emphasis on that, the extent. It really seems that those people that are on the fringes of society, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the foreigners, even the prisoners of war are treated with dignity. And I think that is a reflection of the fact that the view is that all human beings bear God's image, and the way you treat another human being is essentially the way that you treat God himself, which is the point of Genesis 9. And so I think you see that manifested in the Ten Commandments and manifested in the covenantal code. Obviously there's a difference of opinion as to whether this is describing slavery or some other type of system, but nevertheless, I think that to me is what is really impressive, is again, the dignity that's afforded to those people on the edges of society, and the responsibility of every individual to ensure that they live their lives, if they're in a position of influence or of prominence, that their responsibility is to treat those people well.
Josh, you have any thoughts to wrap us up on there?
Protecting the poor and the oppressed, this is the ancient Near Eastern trope. This is what kings did. Everybody go pick up Martha Roth's book on the law collections in Asia Minor, I think it's what it's called, and just read the introductions to each of these law codes. I mean, this is what kings did to protect the poor, to protect the innocent, to protect the weak, to protect the slave. Daisy Yulin Tsai wrote a book on Deuteronomy and the humanitarian developments. I think there probably are some, but generally speaking, slavery in the ancient Near East, slavery in the Hebrew Bible, there's really not a lot of difference between the two.
All right. Well, we did not get to everybody's questions, but that's because there were so many great questions. Really.
What's that? Part 2 coming up one of these days?
What? Part 2? Okay.
I'm in.
Down.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Hey, we definitely have to have you back, Josh. And by the way, we should take a moment to make sure you're able to tell people about your book. Even though I don't think I would agree with the conclusions of your book, I did really appreciate the book. I thought it was fair and balanced and measured and really well thought out. And so it's a great book to see a perspective on that would differ from what a typical Christian might think about quote unquote slavery in the Old Testament. But again, I think it was what was well done and is worth being on everybody's library shelf.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
if they're interested
Josh,
in this question.
Yeah, what is the title of the book, and how do people get it, Josh?
Did the Old
there you
Testament
go.
endure slavery? We published it ourselves, Digital Hammurabi Press. My wife is really the brains behind it. The point of the book is not to break any new ground. Basically, what I'm doing is saying, here's consensus scholarship. So evangelical scholarship, liberal scholarship, whatever people want to call it. This is it's heavily footnoted, is long bibliography. That's the point of it. is to try to get the average reader, the non-specialist who's, interested in this sort of thing, to be able to, so where do I go? Where do I go to look at some of these things? So interestingly enough, this really isn't, I feel like I need to say this. This isn't really a debated issue, not whether God is pro-slavery. I thought that was an interesting title to the stream. But whether the Hebrew Bible endorses slavery is not really debated in evangelical liberal just consensus scholarship. It's not.
Do you think
really
it's an
debated.
entirely different question then?
Yeah, I mean, is God pro-slavery is a theological question.
Yes,
and it's not one that I think that people have misconceptions about what went on in the New Testament and what went on in the early church. The idea that the New Testament comes out strong against slavery is incorrect. Philemon is probably not something we can lean on too terribly much. Jesus' parables are actually very supportive in the sense of explaining and assuming slavery. So, I mean, and of course, the early church. I mean, you have slave collars that have the hero on them. Jennifer Glancy is a great person to read on this, or Ronald Charles. Those two names, Jennifer Glancy, Ronald Charles. Sorry.
And by the way, I should note for the audience, because somebody had mentioned it, Dr. Bowen was a guest on the Non Sequitur show, and he was one of our more popular guests. As a matter of fact, I wish I would have prepared. I didn't even think about this. I have a relief that I got sent from you from Jibba Hammurabi. I still have. I was packing some stuff. I have that, but he has a great channel now that it's all about Assyriology and learning Babylonian stuff. And I mean, it's
all due to Steve, because Steve was like,
course, "You're yes. I don't know any about that stuff."
You said no. First stream, you said so. Dr. Josh, I understand that you're going to start a stream, and I went.
Yeah, we did kind of talk. You know what? You got a point there. We did talk you into it, didn't we?
And you're the one that got me. We just hit 20,000 subs.
Yeah. Okay, so I want my 5%.
You got it.
So Josh, you said that if you were taking this on, you said that this was an interesting way of couching it. That if we were to have a follow-up conversation, because it looks like people in the chat, they're here to the end, they're hanging tight,
this and they're like
they want part 2. So you would approach it more along the lines of, you said, the Old Testament, and how did you phrase that again?
I mean, I think the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, endorses slavery, and what I mean by that is it calls out, it says this is a practice that you can do. And, how people develop that theologically, this argument like from Matthew 19 about divorce and trying to make comparison, you're not going to have a direct connection there. You can make some sort of an implication. The problem is that the early church didn't see it. The early church didn't practice it. And of course, as church history went through, it took a long time to work slavery out. But I mean, those are theological issues. And I think for me, the big point is to try to say, what is it that these passages are saying? What does the Hebrew say? And what are the practices that we see in the ancient Near East that inform those translations? And
you'd be game to come back on and
absolutely.
We'll see if we can.
I would like to get more into the theological implications of it. What if God does allow for slavery? I mean, if you could ask God a question saying, "Hey, God, what did you think of slavery?" What would be his answer, do you think?
It would be Amos 1, 2, and 8.
The interesting thing about Amos is that's mass deportation of people. This is slave market stuff, right? So you can't make a correlation between Leviticus 25.
That's for part 2.
I'm just saying, we put a pin in this. We are so not done.